They wore velvet gowns, walked through candlelit corridors, and their names echoed in castles and courts. To the world, they were princesses, noble daughters, and queens in waiting, wrapped in finery, destined for greatness. But behind the carefully painted portraits and the marriage alliances that defined their futures, the truth was far less romantic. These were not fairy tale lives. These were women born into a world that saw them as valuable only when they could offer something: a dowry, a dynasty, a son. We've been told to remember them as decorative pieces in history's grand puzzle. And Boleyn, the seductress. Mary I, the bitter queen. Lady Jane Grey, the tragic mistake. Elizabeth I, the virgin icon. But what if we told you those stories are only part of the truth, and not always the most honest part? For centuries, the worth of Tudor daughters was measured in pounds, piety, and patriarchy. They were married off like chess pieces, traded for peace or power. They were educated only if it served a man's purpose. Their ambitions were dangerous. Their voices were muted. And when they stepped outside the bounds of what was expected, when they loved the wrong man, spoke too boldly, failed to produce a son, they were punished. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in blood. But these daughters were not weak, not voiceless, not forgettable. This is not just a story of the past, because the echoes of their struggle still reach us today. When modern women are judged by their appearance before their intellect, when leadership is questioned simply because it comes from a woman, when worth is still tied to roles instead of identity, we see history repeating in disguise. So, we're peeling back the layers. We're challenging the myths. We're going beyond the dowries, beyond the crowns, beyond the whispered gossip of Tudor courts. We're looking at the human cost of royal expectations. We're exploring the everyday lives of daughters you've never heard of, but who shaped the world nonetheless. We're redefining what it meant, and what it still means, to be a woman of worth. Because this story isn't just about kings and queens. It's about resilience. It's about rewriting the rules. It's about uncovering strength in the most unexpected places. So if you've ever wondered what history left out, if you've ever felt that the real story lies in the margins, between the lines, in the hearts of the women history tried to forget, then you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to Words of Time, where we don't just revisit history, we reimagine it. We're a space for curious minds, thoughtful storytelling, and truth that goes beyond the textbooks. In this video, we're diving deep into the lives of Tudor daughters and what their experiences reveal about our modern world. So sit back, open your mind, and join us as we journey through centuries to uncover the hidden strength and untold stories of women who deserve to be remembered, fully, honestly, and with the dignity they were long denied. When one thinks of Tudor princesses, the mind often conjures images of regal dresses, courtly dances, and tales of grandeur centered on marriage to foreign princes. This romanticized version, however, is an oversimplification that shadows the intense personal and political complexities these women navigated. They were not just passive pawns exchanged for peace treaties or decorative figures to enhance the dynasty's image. Their roles, while bounded by the social expectations of their time, extended far beyond the requirements of marriage and motherhood. Their experiences reflected a constant negotiation between personal identity and public utility, between autonomy and allegiance. To understand the lives of Tudor daughters, it is essential to first grasp the societal framework they operated within. In Tudor England, a daughter of the monarch was a commodity, albeit a prestigious one. Her value was typically calculated in terms of her dowry, her potential to secure foreign alliances, and her likelihood of bearing male heirs. These elements, rather than intellect, capability, or political insight, formed the foundation upon which her societal worth was based. It is a grim calculus by modern standards, where an individual might instead be valued for education, career achievements, or personal agency. But within the patriarchal machinery of the 16th century, value was often inherited rather than earned. Yet, despite these limitations, many Tudor princesses defied these narrow roles, exerting influence in both subtle and overt ways. Consider the trajectory of Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VII and sister of Henry VIII. Her marriage to the aged King Louis of France was orchestrated to strengthen Anglo-French ties. On paper, she fulfilled her expected role. But what followed upended expectations. After the death of her elderly husband, Mary chose to marry Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, a man of her choosing, not a political match. The scandal was immense. Her bold act risked her brother's wrath and the stability of the court. Yet Mary persisted. In doing so, she demonstrated that Tudor daughters were capable of leveraging their own power, challenging royal protocol for personal fulfillment. Mary's niece, also named Mary, would go on to become England's first reigning queen. Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, was thrust into a political landscape defined by volatility. Her early life was marked by displacement after her father's annulment from her mother. Her legitimacy was questioned, and she was relegated to a lesser household. By all accounts, her value to the state had diminished. She was neither a wife nor a mother, and her dowry, a moot point without marriage, had become irrelevant. Yet, her intellect and fortitude were undeniable. Through sheer will and strategic alliances, she claimed the crown, asserting a woman's right to rule without male oversight. However, Mary's reign also reveals the persistent burden Tudor women faced in balancing power with gendered expectations. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was met with both domestic and parliamentary resistance. The alliance was politically strategic, yet unpopular. It was assumed she would cede authority to her husband, as was custom. Her failure to produce an heir, perhaps the most damning indictment of her reign in the eyes of contemporaries, overshadowed her attempts at governance and religious reform. In modern terms, her worth might have been judged by her ability to rise against misogynistic barriers to hold the highest office in the land. In her time, it was diluted by her perceived failures in marriage and fertility. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, offers another compelling case. Declared illegitimate after her mother's execution, Elizabeth's early life was a tapestry of uncertainty. But what she lacked in official status, she made up for in astute political awareness. Unlike her sister Mary, Elizabeth never married. Her refusal to do so was not born of disinterest, but of strategy. Each potential suitor represented an alliance, a risk, a concession of power. By remaining unmarried, Elizabeth retained autonomy, a rare commodity for any woman in Tudor England, let alone a monarch. She effectively redefined the expected trajectory of royal daughters. While she maintained the illusion of potential marriage, using it as a diplomatic tool, she ultimately answered to no husband and bore no heirs. Elizabeth's reign, often romanticized as a golden age, also illuminates the dichotomy of perception versus reality. While she ruled with authority and inspired loyalty, she also endured constant scrutiny over her marital status and womanhood. Her image was carefully crafted to straddle virginity and sovereignty, femininity and command. Though she never became a wife or mother, roles traditionally seen as the apex of a woman's worth, she cultivated a legacy rooted in intellect, rhetoric, and political finesse. These women, Mary Tudor, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, did not live in a vacuum. They were deeply influenced by their maternal figures and the courtly culture in which they were raised. Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn and Jane Seymour, among others, were not merely vessels for royal offspring. They were educators, negotiators, and in some cases, agents of reform. Catherine ensured her daughter Mary was well educated, grounding her in classical studies and strong Catholic faith. And Boleyn's advocacy for reformist scholars played a role in shaping the future queen's outlook. Even Jane Seymour, who died shortly after giving birth to Edward VI, impacted the court by symbolizing the fulfillment of a queen's ultimate duty, delivering a male heir. The dichotomy between Tudor expectations and modern sensibilities becomes even more striking when one considers how each of these women might be evaluated today. Instead of dowries and dynastic alliances, imagine their worth judged by leadership, resilience, and moral conviction. Mary Tudor's defiance in marrying for love would be celebrated as a stand for personal agency. Mary I's fight to assert her legitimacy and authority in a male-dominated sphere would be viewed through the lens of feminist resistance. Elizabeth's decision to govern alone would be heralded as an act of radical self-determination. Even beyond the royal daughters, lesser-known Tudor women experienced the same oppressive structures and at times found similar paths of defiance. Margaret Douglas, niece of Henry VIII, maneuvered through the treacherous waters of court life, enduring imprisonment for unauthorized romantic entanglements. Lady Jane Grey, though queen for only 9 days, found herself trapped in political schemes not of her making, ultimately paying with her life for ambitions that were not hers. These stories, often told in the margins, further emphasize that Tudor daughters were not monoliths of docility and duty. They were survivors in a volatile age. Marriage, of course, remained a near inescapable expectation for these women. It was the prescribed conclusion to their narrative arc. Yet, many subverted this outcome or wielded it to their advantage. In Tudor England, a marriage could be both a cage and a catapult. For some, like Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, marriage was a platform for intellectual exploration and religious influence. Widowed multiple times, Parr authored books, advocated for the Protestant cause, and managed a complex royal household. Though married, she exercised a degree of intellectual freedom rare among her peers. The framework that defined these women's lives, a rigid matrix of patriarchal values and dynastic ambition, may seem foreign today, yet its echoes persist. The expectation that women should prioritize family over ambition, beauty over intellect, compliance over courage, still lingers in modern discourse. The Tudor daughters remind us that these expectations have long been questioned and resisted. They reveal that within even the most oppressive structures, there is space for agency, strategy, and self-definition. One might ask, what did it mean to be a successful Tudor daughter? Was it to secure a powerful marriage? To bear heirs? To serve loyally? Or could success be found in resistance, in crafting one's path amid predetermined roles? The Tudor era, with its brutal power shifts and intricate court dynamics, created conditions where women had to be both pliant and shrewd. The ones who survived, and especially those who thrived, did so not because they adhered to expectations, but because they manipulated, challenged, and at times defied them. It is tempting to view their stories as merely tragic or heroic, but the truth is more nuanced. These were not just women navigating personal desires. They were public figures bearing the weight of national and dynastic survival. Their marriages, or lack thereof, were matters of state. Their pregnancies, or miscarriages, had geopolitical consequences. Every decision was layered with consequence. In that sense, their lives were less fairy tale and more chess game, each move calculated, each misstep potentially fatal. In modern terms, if we were to assign value based on societal contribution, educational attainment, leadership capability, and personal autonomy, the ledger of Tudor daughters would look very different. Elizabeth, with her extensive patronage of the arts, her deft handling of religious division, and her maintenance of national stability, would rank highly. Mary I, despite the contentiousness of her reign, would earn recognition for her tenacity and resolve. Mary Tudor would be admired for challenging the status quo, asserting her right to choose love over politics. Their lives invite us to reconsider our own metrics of worth. What does it mean to live a valuable life? Is it defined by what society expects of us, or by how we navigate and challenge those expectations? Tudor daughters lived in an age where their fate was often determined before they were born, but they found ways to leave their mark nonetheless. Their stories are not just relics of the past, but blueprints for resilience, strategy, and self-possession. While the language of dowries and alliances may seem outdated, its modern equivalents are still with us. Career trajectories shaped by gender bias, societal pressure to marry or have children, assumptions about leadership based on appearance or demeanor. The Tudor daughters remind us that these pressures are neither new nor immutable. They reveal that power can be found even within constraint, and that resistance does not always come in the form of revolution. It can be quiet, patient, and strategic. By peeling back the layers of courtly ritual and royal duty, we uncover lives marked by longing, ambition, heartbreak, and resolve. These were not caricatures of queens and consorts. They were human beings negotiating a world not built for them. And in doing so, they paved the way, however subtly, for future generations of women to reimagine their roles, to challenge the metrics of their worth, and to demand a fuller accounting of their value. In remembering them, not as mere daughters traded for peace or brides crowned for fertility, but as individuals of intellect, strength, and agency, we restore to them the fullness of their humanity. And in that restoration, we find not just history, but inspiration. The absence of a male heir in Tudor England was more than a matter of personal misfortune. It was a political catastrophe, a national anxiety, a symbolic unraveling of order as defined by patriarchal structures. To modern sensibilities, infertility or lack of succession might be interpreted through a private lens, a personal grief, a family struggle. But within the Tudor framework, particularly for queens, the womb was not just a private organ. It was a public expectation, a dynastic contract, a symbol of continuity and stability for the realm. This pressure was uniquely sharpened in the case of reigning queens. For male monarchs, the issue of succession was significant, but not entirely destabilizing. The crown, in theory, passed naturally through male lineage, and the king had the luxury of attempting succession through multiple marriages or acknowledged illegitimate sons if necessary. Female monarchs had no such leniency. Their failure to produce a male heir was perceived not only as a personal shortcoming, but also as a national vulnerability, a failure to uphold divine order and dynastic preservation. Consider Mary, daughter of Henry and Catherine. Upon ascending the throne, she faced more than just political unrest and religious division. She faced the immediate, almost suffocating expectation to marry and produce an heir, specifically a male one. Her union with Philip of Spain was meant to serve both political and reproductive ends. The alliance was intended to fortify England's Catholic revival, but its success was ultimately tied to Mary's ability to carry a child. When Mary announced her first pregnancy, the court buzzed with optimism. Prayers were offered. Preparations were made. Yet, the child never came. Whether it was a miscarriage, a false pregnancy, or an undiagnosed medical condition, the effect was the same: national disappointment. The absence of a child did not simply affect her personal legacy, it destabilized her reign. Without an heir, her authority seemed tenuous. Plots brewed. Opposition grew. Protestants found courage in the uncertainty. And with each failed sign of pregnancy, her position weakened further. The nation, conditioned to seek security in male continuity, began to turn its gaze toward her sister Elizabeth. Mary's failure to produce a son became not just a tragedy, but a liability. The psychology of this crisis cannot be overstated. Tudor England did not separate the body of the monarch from the body politic. The Queen's reproductive system was a matter of state. Her swelling belly, her perceived ailments, her fertility, and her menstrual cycles, these were not whispered curiosities, but public concerns. Midwives and ambassadors alike speculated on her condition. Rumors of pregnancies rose and fell like political fortunes. The Queen's physical health was intertwined with the nation's spiritual and constitutional health. Elizabeth, by contrast, upended this entire narrative. Her decision never to marry was radical not just in its departure from social norms, but in its challenge to the very logic of dynastic politics. If a queen's legitimacy came through motherhood, what did it mean when the Queen rejected motherhood altogether? Elizabeth's refusal to produce an heir created a paradox. On one hand, it was seen as selfish or even dangerous. Without a clear successor, England lived under the constant threat of civil war. On the other hand, her decision preserved her power. As an unmarried woman, she avoided the very real threat of ceding authority to a husband or creating factions through heirs. Still, Elizabeth's childlessness was a national concern, and not one she could entirely deflect. The question of succession lingered over her reign like a persistent shadow. Foreign dignitaries probed. Parliament pleaded. Advisors worried. But Elizabeth, with unshakable determination, kept her own counsel. She crafted an image of herself as the Virgin Queen, wedded not to man but to her people, not to fertility but to faith and governance. This was a brilliant political maneuver, transforming what was viewed as a failing into a source of divine authority. Yet, the anxiety beneath remained. No heir meant no future, at least in the eyes of those bound to traditional succession logic. In truth, both Mary and Elizabeth faced an impossible task. Mary tried to fulfill the script and was punished when she could not. Elizabeth rewrote the script and was condemned for the uncertainty it produced. In both cases, the lack of a male heir was not viewed as the failure of the system, but of the individual woman. It was she who had failed the body politic. She who had disrupted divine order. She who had let the nation down. This gendered expectation persisted not just within elite circles, but throughout the social hierarchy. The belief that peace and prosperity were linked to male rule permeated sermons, literature, and folk wisdom. Queens were always viewed as exceptions, tolerated only when no better option was available. Their success was conditional, always provisional. Their authority depended on their ability to conform, however paradoxically, to a model of rule designed for men. The absence of a male heir did more than unsettle political calculations. It fractured the spiritual narrative that underpinned monarchy. Monarchs ruled not just by blood, but by divine sanction. Without a son, the line risked breaking, the covenant seemed void, and the nation's sense of ordained order faltered. The monarch was God's chosen vessel, and if that vessel was barren or broken, what did it say about divine favor? In such a context, Childlessness was not merely a matter of sadness, it was a crisis of faith. There is also a deep cruelty in how these expectations stripped women of the right to grieve privately. Mary, after years of humiliation and rejection in her youth, finally held power and the chance to redeem her mother's legacy. But she was haunted by miscarriages or medical illusions of pregnancy. To be both queen and woman meant her body was never her own. It belonged to history, to expectation, to scrutiny. Elizabeth, too, bore the burden of being constantly asked what she would not give, an heir. Her refusal did not liberate her from the question. It only intensified its political charge. To reframe these experiences through a modern lens is to uncover layers of structural injustice. What would it mean to recognize that the lack of male succession was not a personal failure, but a systemic one? That the anxiety over childlessness was less about maternal inadequacy and more about patriarchal panic? That queens were forced to bear the psychological and political costs of a model of rule that had no place for their autonomy? Even in their most private moments, these women were not allowed to be just themselves. They were mothers before they were wives, symbols before they were individuals. The womb was their battlefield, the cradle their claim to legitimacy. When that cradle remained empty, the criticism was swift and unforgiving. Yet despite this, they ruled. Mary ruled through resistance and devotion. Elizabeth ruled through intellect and spectacle. Each bore the burden of her own narrative, rewritten again and again by male courtiers, chroniclers, and critics. Their failures were magnified, their triumphs often minimized. But they endured, crafting reigns that shaped not just Tudor history, but the identity of England itself. It is also worth remembering how male rulers in the same period were treated when they failed to produce heirs. Henry, for example, fathered multiple children, legitimate and otherwise, but his obsessive quest for a male successor drove him to annulments, executions, and the transformation of the church itself. His failures were not framed as personal weaknesses, but as political necessities. When he did not get what he wanted, the world around him changed to accommodate his will. Queens were never afforded that privilege. The system bent for kings and broke queens. In that light, the tragedy is not that Mary and Elizabeth failed to give England sons. The tragedy is that England could not imagine a future that did not depend on them doing so. The narrow definitions of success, through childbirth, marriage, and male continuity, ensured that queens would always govern in a state of exception, never quite equal to their male counterparts in expectation or judgment. Their legacy, however, has outlived those expectations. Mary is remembered for her religious zeal and tragic quest for stability. Elizabeth is immortalized for her diplomacy, her court, her golden age. But beneath those surface narratives lies the deeper truth of what they endured. Their bodies were battlegrounds. Their legacies were born of pain as much as power. By re-examining these stories, we challenge not only our understanding of history, but also our assumptions about value, power, and gender. We begin to see that succession was not just a question of lineage, but a crucible through which queens were tested, and often unfairly judged. The absence of male heirs did not mark them as failures. It marked the failure of a system unwilling to evolve. The stories of these Tudor women remind us that leadership and legacy do not hinge solely on reproduction. Power can be exercised in many forms, through law, through culture, through presence, through refusal. Mary and Elizabeth did not rule because they were mothers. They ruled despite not being mothers. And in doing so, they left behind examples of female authority that resonate beyond their century. In every whispered rumor of a phantom pregnancy, in every desperate marriage negotiation, in every prayer offered for a male child, the pressure they faced becomes more visible. But so too does their courage. Their unwillingness to collapse under that weight, their determination to define their reigns in terms other than fertility, reveals a quiet but profound resistance. To understand Tudor queens only through the lens of motherhood is to miss the full scope of their lives. They were more than potential mothers. They were rulers, reformers, thinkers, and survivors. They challenged a system designed to marginalize them, and in doing so reshaped it. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to leave a mark. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson they offer. Not that they failed to bear sons, but that they succeeded in bearing witness to their own strength. That they left behind not children, but change. That in a world where their worth was reduced to reproduction, they insisted on being more. This insistence echoes forward, urging us to reconsider how we measure worth today. What assumptions do we still carry about gender and power? What narrow definitions still govern our understanding of success? The Tudor queens may have ruled centuries ago, but their stories remain unsettlingly current. In them, we see the costs of a society that equates identity with function, worth with conformity. In revisiting their lives with clearer eyes, we honor not only their triumphs, but also their trials. We see them not as symbols, but as people. And in that recognition, we offer them something they were rarely given in their own time: empathy without condition, value without requirement, and legacy without apology. Elizabeth, from the earliest moments of her life, bore the weight of uncertainty. Born to Anne, whose marriage to Henry shattered England's bond with the Roman Church, Elizabeth entered a world already politically unstable. Her mother's execution and her subsequent illegitimacy stripped her of rank and security. Though born a princess, she was quickly labeled a bastard and pushed to the margins of court life. Her title changed, her household changed, and her standing at court changed. But what never changed was the awareness that her presence was dangerous, her claim to power controversial, and her life conditional. The court watched her closely, her every move scrutinized not just for decorum, but for evidence of allegiance or ambition. She was too clever, too poised, too self-controlled for many to trust. Her education, championed by a select few who recognized her brilliance, only added to the unease. An intelligent woman was not always an admired one in Tudor England. A woman who could speak multiple languages, who read philosophy and theology with ease, and who could debate with diplomats was not seen as a treasure, but a threat, especially when she was the daughter of a disgraced queen and a king whose marital legacy was littered with destruction. Elizabeth's youth was shaped not just by instability, but by visible proximity to danger. During her sister Mary's reign, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same place where her mother had been held before her execution. Accused of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion, she was questioned and watched, her fate hanging by a thread. The air around her was so thick with suspicion that survival itself became an act of political navigation. She learned not just to endure scrutiny, but to manage it. Her expressions were measured, her words chosen with precision, her loyalties kept deliberately opaque. This was not natural aloofness, it was survival. Even when Elizabeth became queen, the scrutiny did not fade. It evolved. No longer accused of treason, she was instead accused of failing to marry. Her reign, despite its length and achievements, was never free of the relentless pressure to produce an heir. Without a husband, without a child, she was accused of selfishness, of vanity, of unnatural coldness. Rumors swirled around her relationships with favorites like Robert Dudley. Foreign courts mocked her. Domestic advisors pleaded with her. Yet Elizabeth remained unmoved, choosing instead to solidify her legacy on her own terms. She knew that marriage meant ceding power, and that even a child could invite civil unrest. It wasn't just about love or preference. It was strategy, forged in the fire of a life where her survival had always depended on silence, calculation, and control. Still, the toll was immense. Her refusal to marry came at the cost of personal companionship and likely emotional peace. Her image, the Virgin Queen Gloriana, a goddess draped in iconography, was both a mask and a shield. Beneath it was a woman who had been hunted, betrayed, isolated. She had become more than a ruler. She had become an idea, a symbol onto which others projected their fears, hopes, and anger. The cost of that symbolism was solitude. The cost of security was a life lived in guardedness. If Elizabeth became powerful by resisting the expectations placed upon her, Mary's path to the throne was carved through pain, submission, and the bitter endurance of betrayal. From the moment Henry set aside her mother, Catherine, Mary was relegated to the periphery. Once the cherished daughter of a pious queen, she became an inconvenience, a reminder of a past her father wished to erase. Her household was dissolved, her friends dismissed, her very identity rewritten. She was told that her parents had never been married, that she was illegitimate, that her mother had lied. The emotional devastation of such revisionism cannot be overstated. Mary, whose faith was unshakable, saw her world turned into a living heresy. She refused to sign documents acknowledging the annulment. She refused to renounce her mother's title. And for that, she was punished. Her allowance was cut. Her movements were restricted. She was isolated, not just from court but from hope. For years, she lived under the threat of total erasure. Only her quiet defiance and spiritual conviction sustained her. In a court ruled by whim, Mary clung to the only certainty she had left: her faith and her memory of who she had once been. When she finally emerged as queen, her victory was not sweet. It was hard-won, precarious, and marred by immediate unrest. She had to claim her throne by force, rallying supporters against Jane, a young cousin placed on the throne by those who feared Mary's Catholicism. Yet even in victory, Mary remained constrained by the expectations of her office. She was queen, but she was still a woman. That meant marriage. That meant children. That meant a restoration of traditional order, with Mary fulfilling the maternal script that had eluded her own mother in the eyes of the court, bearing a male heir to restore England to Catholic purity. Her marriage to Philip was, at best, a political calculation and at worst, a desperate compromise. He was cold. He was foreign. He was unpopular. Yet Mary endured him, and the humiliations of pregnancy announcements that led only to emptiness. Again and again, she prepared for birth, only to be met with silence. Her body, once a battleground of political significance, became a source of embarrassment and whispered mockery. She failed, they said, to do the one thing a queen was meant to do. But it was never failure on Mary's part. It was the cruelty of a society that defined a woman's worth by her womb. Even in her religious convictions, Mary was misunderstood. Her persecution of Protestants, brutal as it was, stemmed not just from power, but from trauma. She had seen her mother humiliated by religious reformers. She had been personally victimized by her father's religious transformation. To her, Catholicism was not just a faith, but a lifeline, a vindication of her suffering. Her desire to restore it was not just doctrinal. It was deeply personal. Yet history remembers her not as a woman of conviction, but as Bloody Mary, a tyrant painted in harsh strokes. The woman beneath, the neglected daughter, the traumatized child, the haunted queen, is often forgotten. Lady Jane Grey's story, perhaps more than any other, exemplifies how Tudor daughters were shaped not by their own desires, but by the ruthless ambitions of others. Jane was brilliant, fluent in multiple languages, well-read in theology, devout in her Protestant beliefs. But none of this mattered when she became useful. She was a pawn, positioned by her parents and by the Duke of Northumberland to take the throne in place of Mary. She had no say in it. She did not seek it. But her lineage, combined with her religion, made her ideal in the eyes of those desperate to keep a Catholic off the throne. At barely 16, Jane was declared queen. She reigned for just over a week, held in a palace not of her choosing, wearing a crown she had never wanted. Her letters during this time reflect confusion, fear, and a sense of foreboding. When Mary gathered enough support to claim the throne, Jane was imprisoned. She might have been spared. Mary initially showed mercy. But rebellion continued in Jane's name, and eventually, Mary's political survival required Jane's execution. Jane died not because of her own actions, but because of the machinations of those around her. Her life was short, her death tragic, but her story is vital. It reveals the depth of exploitation that Tudor daughters endured. Jane was commodified by her family, manipulated by men in power, and ultimately discarded by a system that had no space for reluctant queens. Her intelligence and virtue meant nothing when set against dynastic panic and religious paranoia. In Jane, we see the perfect storm of Tudor expectations. A woman's value was tied not to who she was, but to what others could make of her. She was useful until she was dangerous, loyal until she became a threat, and then she was expendable. Her death was not just an execution. It was a symptom of a society that allowed no room for innocence in the game of power. Together, these stories, Elizabeth's careful navigation of suspicion, Mary's tormented battle for recognition, Jane's tragic manipulation, form a tapestry of what it meant to be a daughter in Tudor England. They were born into a system that saw them not as full people, but as parts of a larger dynastic puzzle. Their bodies were used to broker alliances, their minds dismissed unless needed for propaganda, and their emotions buried beneath expectation. The human cost of royal expectations, then, was not merely physical. It was psychological, emotional, and spiritual. It left queens childless and blamed. It left daughters imprisoned and erased. It left girls like Jane dead before they had lived. Yet, amid the pain and injustice, there is also immense strength. These women endured, resisted, and in some cases, transformed the very structures meant to contain them. Elizabeth turned suspicion into sovereignty. Mary turned rejection into rule. Jane turned victimhood into quiet dignity, meeting her death with courage that belied her years. Their stories ask us not only to remember them, but to question the world that shaped them, to consider how much has changed and how much has not, to see, in their trials, reflections of the pressures still placed on women today, pressures of perfection, of motherhood, of sacrifice. By looking closely at their lives, not through the lens of legend, but through the texture of their humanity, we do not simply learn history. We witness the legacy of survival, the price of ambition, and the enduring power of choice, even in the smallest, most fleeting of moments. And in doing so, we restore to these Tudor daughters what history too often denies: their full, complex, and powerful humanity. Beyond the palaces, beyond the jeweled crowns and ceremonial robes, lived the countless daughters of Tudor England whose stories were not preserved in state records or royal chronicles. Their lives unfolded not in throne rooms, but in manor houses, city shops, and village cottages. Though their names are mostly lost to time, their existence shaped the social fabric of the age just as surely as that of their royal counterparts. They too were daughters shaped by expectation, molded not by destiny's spotlight, but by the daily grind of familial duty, obedience, and societal structure. Whether noble, gentry, merchant, or peasant, their experiences, though varied, were all governed by the central question that defined womanhood in Tudor England: how best to serve the family's interest. For noble families, daughters were critical assets in the negotiation of status and power. In a world where property, title, and loyalty could be exchanged as easily as land, a noble daughter's marriage was a carefully planned transaction. She was born with a value already assigned to her name, a potential dowry, a lineage, a strategic bond. From early childhood, her upbringing was tailored not to cultivate personal ambition, but to prepare her for this role. She learned needlework, comportment, languages when possible, and how to manage a household. Education, when it was offered, was designed not to foster independence, but to enhance her desirability in the marriage market. These young women were often betrothed before they could understand the weight of the decisions being made for them. A girl of 10 might already be promised to a boy of similar status, their union carefully orchestrated to solidify a family alliance or settle a debt. Consent was not required. Emotional readiness was not considered. Their bodies were not seen as their own, but as vessels for lineage and instruments of alliance. Once married, many were sent to unfamiliar households, sometimes far from the family that raised them. They were expected to adapt, to obey their new husbands, and most importantly, to bear sons. Some of these noble daughters managed to carve spaces of quiet resistance or personal influence. In letters, some expressed dissatisfaction, and occasionally, affection grew where none had been expected. A few, like Bess of Hardwick, used their marriages to increase wealth and status with remarkable skill. But even the most successful maneuvering could not escape the framework within which they were judged. A noblewoman who failed to produce children, particularly male ones, or who resisted her husband's will, was a liability. Her survival, like that of the queens above her in rank, depended on her ability to meet the exacting standards of female usefulness. In the rising merchant and gentry classes, the roles and expectations shifted subtly, but no less significantly. These daughters lived on the edge of transition. As towns expanded and commerce flourished, families outside the hereditary aristocracy gained wealth and influence. For some daughters in these households, this brought with it slightly more flexibility. A merchant father might consider a daughter's preferences when arranging a match, especially if the family was upwardly mobile and eager to forge socially beneficial connections through marriage. In such cases, charm, education, and personal reputation played roles not just in sealing alliances, but in expanding family fortunes. Moreover, the domestic structure of merchant families sometimes allowed daughters to play visible roles in business affairs. A girl raised in a shop-keeping household might learn to handle accounts, assist in managing apprentices, or even interact with customers. In a brewing household, she might help run the day-to-day logistics of distribution and quality control. In some rare instances, widowed daughters or unmarried women ran businesses outright, managing property, lending money, and engaging in trade. These women were still subject to patriarchal structures, but they operated with a measure of agency that would have been unthinkable for their noble counterparts. Even so, their success depended on a careful balancing act. A merchant's daughter had to be industrious but not overbearing, clever but not too opinionated, visible but not improper. Her future, like that of all women in this society, remained tethered to reputation and marriageability. A scandal, a poorly judged courtship, or the appearance of impropriety could ruin a family's social ambitions. For this reason, many families kept their daughters close, watching interactions, filtering opportunities, and sometimes curtailing freedoms. Agency, when it existed, was conditional, granted by fathers or brothers, and often revoked without explanation. Yet within these constraints, there was space for subtle influence. A daughter who earned her father's trust might advocate for siblings, negotiate minor deals, or advise on household management. A woman who became a widow might gain control over a business or estate, especially if her husband died without a male heir. The law, though restrictive, allowed for occasional exceptions. These women lived in the margins of authority, using silence, strategy, and service to survive and occasionally to flourish. Beyond the walls of manor houses and merchant halls lived the majority of Tudor daughters, the commoners, whose lives were marked not by lineage or marriage contracts, but by labor. In agricultural villages and crowded towns, daughters were born into work. From early childhood, they contributed to the survival of their families. They helped prepare food, tend animals, spin thread, gather fuel, and care for younger siblings. In farming households, they worked in the fields alongside their parents. In urban ones, they ran errands, carried water, or took up small apprenticeships in trades when available. These daughters did not have dowries in the traditional sense. If they were lucky, they might receive a modest sum, a cow, or household goods. Marriage was less about alliance and more about survival. They married local men, laborers, apprentices, journeymen, not out of strategic design but out of necessity and availability. Some served as maids or wet nurses in wealthier households, sending earnings home when possible. Their contribution was physical, immediate, and largely unrecorded. They lived in the background of history, doing the work that sustained communities without recognition. The choices available to them were sharply limited. A misstep, a pregnancy out of wedlock, an accusation of dishonor, an illness, could drastically alter a life. Marriage was often the only path to stability, and even that came with risks. A cruel husband, an early death, or poverty could undo years of effort. Yet many of these women found ways to create dignity and strength within their circumstances. They nurtured, endured, and built networks of mutual support among other women. In village churches, in marketplaces, in small gatherings, they shared knowledge, traded services, and sometimes acted as informal midwives, healers, or matchmakers. They were the invisible backbone of Tudor society. Their hands made the bread, wove the cloth, and cleaned the homes. Their voices were quieted by circumstance but echoed in lullabies, warnings, and whispered prayers. Their absence from official records does not mean they lacked meaning or worth. It means the society they lived in did not think their stories worth preserving. But they were there, in every generation, carrying the burdens placed upon them by birth and gender with resilience that deserves remembrance. Across all these layers, noble, gentry, merchant, common, the threads of expectation remain tightly bound. Whether preparing for a political marriage or stirring a communal pot, Tudor daughters were expected to serve. Their lives were defined not by what they wanted, but by what they were needed for. And yet, in their own ways, they shaped the world they inherited. Through whispered counsel, through careful marriages, through secret acts of defiance or labor offered without thanks, they sustained the dynasties, communities, and families that history tends to name only through their fathers and brothers. What binds all these daughters together, from the highest towers of court to the smallest village cottage, is the shared experience of being seen first and foremost as future wives and mothers. Whatever their talents, whatever their dreams, the measure of their success rested on their ability to conform to expectations imposed by others. Yet within those confines, many found ways to exert influence. Sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, sometimes only after their deaths when their wills or letters revealed the full scope of their thoughts and decisions. Their stories may not end in coronation or rebellion, but they are no less significant. They tell us about endurance, about silent influence, about the quiet revolutions carried out in kitchens, parlors, and fields. They remind us that power is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it resides in patience, in resourcefulness, in the simple act of continuing in a world that offers little in return. These women may not have worn crowns, but they carried weights just as heavy, and they did so with a grace that deserves to be remembered. Their lives form the heartbeat of Tudor England, steady, vital, and too often overlooked. The story of Tudor daughters, so often reduced to their marital prospects or biological roles, holds a deeper, more compelling truth beneath the surface. These women, bound by social expectation and patriarchal law, were not passive figures drifting through history. They were, in many cases, silent architects of change, negotiators of survival, and cultivators of influence that defied their prescribed limits. Their power may not have always worn a crown or held a seal, but it operated nonetheless, through words, presence, relationships, and intellect. To understand the true extent of their value, one must look beyond the roles they were given and into the roles they crafted for themselves when no permission was granted to claim them. Among the noble classes, where daughters were often trained to serve dynastic ambitions, some rose to quietly shape the course of politics, religion, and culture. These women learned early how to read a room, how to guide conversations, how to support causes not with declarations, but with gestures, alliances, and social maneuvering. While their brothers studied law or governance, they mastered the art of persuasion through correspondence, marriage diplomacy, and courtly observation. Their influence lived in the margins, subtle, enduring, and often underestimated. Margaret Beaufort, though predating the core of the Tudor period, casts a long shadow over the dynasty's daughters. Her legacy is a foundation upon which later Tudor women stood. As the mother of Henry, Margaret never officially ruled, yet she orchestrated his rise to the throne with deliberate strategy and unwavering focus. Her deep involvement in courtly affairs, her religious patronage, and her investment in education laid groundwork that influenced generations. Her correspondence, charitable work, and discreet political maneuvering demonstrate that power for women in her position was never absolute, but always possible through clever deployment of resources and relationships. This model of quiet strength continued in women like Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, who used her position to support religious reform and offer protection to Protestant thinkers. Her household became a refuge, her words a shield, and her money a weapon. Despite facing personal loss and political shifts that could have undone her, she persisted. She used her visibility not for vanity but for service, to ideas, to causes, and to those who shared her values. Her story reminds us that influence often lives in the unsung moments. A conversation with the right person, a letter passed at the right time, a sanctuary offered when the law turned cruel. Elizabeth's court, too, was populated by women whose value extended beyond appearance. Ladies-in-waiting, often assumed to be mere ornaments, became conduits of information, protectors of secrets, and informal ambassadors. They managed correspondence, advised on marriage matters, and engaged in religious discussions. Figures like Blanche Parry, who served Elizabeth for decades, were confidants and companions, helping the Queen navigate not only the politics of governance, but the emotional toll of isolation and expectation. These women understood the stakes and worked within the narrow paths available to them, shaping decisions that carried national consequence. Beyond court circles, there were daughters in gentry and merchant households who influenced their families and communities through education, practical governance, and moral leadership. When women managed estates during their husbands' absences, particularly in times of war or political unrest, they demonstrated administrative skill and financial oversight. Letters from the period reveal women balancing books, hiring workers, resolving disputes, and managing harvests. These responsibilities were often assumed temporarily, but many women proved so competent that their authority endured even after the return of male relatives. In the world of letters and learning, women like Jane Lumley and Mary Sidney crafted legacies of their own. Jane translated classical works into English, contributing to the intellectual life of the period. Mary, sister of the poet Philip Sidney, was not only a writer herself, but a significant patron of the arts. Her literary circle fostered innovation, and her translations and original poetry gave voice to female intellect in a realm typically closed to women. She used her position not merely for display, but as a platform, encouraging theological debate, supporting Protestant scholarship, and mentoring younger writers. These examples, scattered across the social spectrum, show that Tudor daughters were often at their most powerful when they were least expected to be. Their strength resided not in titles or proclamations, but in adaptability, persistence, and insight. They learned to thrive in a world that limited their choices by expanding their influence through indirect means. They became experts in the politics of presence, in the currency of reputation, in the economy of alliances. Every move required calculation. Every word carried consequence. Yet they did not retreat into passivity. They participated carefully and consciously in the shaping of their world. The resilience of Tudor women must also be understood within the constant tension of survival in a male-dominated society. They endured laws that stripped them of property rights upon marriage, social customs that judged them solely by chastity and obedience, and religious doctrines that painted them as spiritually weaker than men. In such a context, even the smallest assertion of agency was an act of resistance. Some resisted overtly. Women who fled arranged marriages, who challenged guardians in court, who chose lives in religious or intellectual communities over domestic servitude. Others resisted by subverting expectations, excelling in needlework or domestic management not merely to please, but to build economic security, becoming indispensable to their households in ways that ensured greater autonomy. Every act of self-assertion, every moment of refusal or redefinition, was an act of courage. These were women told that their worth came from their silence, yet they spoke. Told that their value came from beauty, yet they labored. Told that their purpose was to serve, yet they led. The daily lives of Tudor daughters were filled with decisions that required negotiation and endurance. When faced with scandal, they had to protect not just their reputations, but their entire families. When faced with poverty, they made choices that meant survival or ruin. They married out of duty, but many found ways to reshape those unions. They became counselors to husbands, caretakers to siblings, defenders of family honor, and keepers of collective memory. Their wisdom was not recorded in state papers, but it was etched into the decisions that preserved households, maintained estates, and educated future generations. Education, too, became a path through which Tudor daughters redefined their value. While most women were denied formal schooling, those who received instruction often used it not merely as ornamentation, but as a tool for deeper engagement. They read the scriptures, interpreted legal texts, composed letters with rhetorical skill, and educated their children with purpose. In doing so, they reshaped what literacy meant for women. It was not simply about reading prayers, but about forming opinions, preserving family legacy, and participating in cultural life. Even in the religious sphere, where women were often constrained to the roles of piety and submission, many found opportunities for subtle leadership. Female patronage of churches, convents, and religious scholars allowed them to shape local spiritual life. Women's involvement in religious reform movements, whether Catholic or Protestant, also demonstrated their ability to align personal belief with public action. Some opened their homes to clandestine worship, others funded the printing of religious texts. They were never passive recipients of doctrine. They were interpreters, challengers, and implementers of faith within the bounds of their communities. Their resilience was, in many ways, a daily practice. It was the young girl who walked miles to fetch water and returned to help her mother spin wool. It was the adolescent who endured marriage to a stranger and found a way to keep her children fed through ingenuity. It was the widow who reclaimed her husband's workshop and taught her sons to read. It was the court lady who withheld her thoughts in public, but shaped policy in private. Resilience was the invisible thread that tied them together. It did not always manifest in grand gestures, but in continued presence, despite grief, despite abuse, despite abandonment, despite expectation. What emerges from these lives, when we take the time to trace them, is not a story of compliance, but of survival. Tudor daughters did not accept their place. They inhabited it with complexity, and when possible, expanded it. They pushed against the edges of their cages, often without the world noticing. But their impact is clear. They held families together. They made communities function. They kept the rhythms of life moving forward. And when they could, they reached beyond even that, to influence art, religion, politics, and culture. This redefinition of value does not require the rejection of traditional roles, but the recognition that those roles were never as simple as they appeared. A wife was often a manager, a mother a teacher, a daughter an advocate, a noblewoman a strategist, a commoner a provider. They were not just fulfilling duties, they were navigating an unforgiving world, shaping it where they could, surviving it when they had to, and challenging it in the moments where opportunity appeared. To remember them as merely victims of their era is to miss the complexity of their lives. They were, at once, shaped by the system, and yet constantly reshaping it from within. They embodied both vulnerability and strength, restriction and resourcefulness. And in that duality, they carved out identities that defied simplification. In returning to these stories, we do not simply recover lost voices. We challenge the frameworks that made those voices forgettable. We look again at value and ask new questions. What if strength is quiet? What if leadership is invisible? What if influence can be hidden in a gesture, a word, a refusal? Tudor daughters, in all their roles and across all their circumstances, reveal a truth that stretches beyond their time. They show us that human worth cannot be measured by visibility alone. It is found in action, in intent, in endurance. And once we see that, their lives no longer remain on the margins of history. They take their rightful place at its heart, not as symbols of what was endured, but as examples of what was achieved despite it. Even within the confines of a world structured to limit their visibility, Tudor daughters quietly etched their marks into the cultural fabric of their era. These were not women who simply moved through life passively, following the rules without question or adaptation. They were individuals who absorbed the complexities of their environment and, often without formal recognition, responded with creativity, learning, and profound contributions that outlived them. Their influence did not always carry the weight of formal authorship or public acclaim, but it flowed through households, communities, and intellectual circles, slowly reshaping the cultural landscape of Tudor England. One of the most significant, yet often overlooked, areas where Tudor daughters left a lasting imprint was in education. While formal schooling was largely reserved for sons of the elite, and universities were inaccessible to women, many daughters of the nobility and gentry were given access to private tutors, often sharing educational resources with their brothers. This access to knowledge, though uneven and deeply shaped by class, enabled a number of women to engage in scholarly pursuits that extended beyond the domestic or decorative. Some daughters became skilled translators, a respected intellectual activity during the period. Their translations often bridged the gap between classical texts and contemporary religious or political concerns. These works allowed Tudor women to participate in the life of ideas, especially within the boundaries of Protestant reform or moral instruction. Though they rarely wrote original treatises, their translations were not mechanical exercises. They required interpretive choices, cultural sensitivity, and a nuanced grasp of both language and ideology. These texts, shared within households or printed under family names, extended their influence far beyond their intended recipients. The Sidney family provides a striking example of this type of cultural engagement. Mary Sidney, sister of the celebrated poet Philip Sidney, was a literary force in her own right. Her work as a translator and poet helped shape the spiritual and poetic values of the English Renaissance. Through her translations of psalms and classical texts, she navigated a space where female intellect could flourish within the acceptable frame of religious devotion. But devotion was never a limitation. It was a medium through which she exercised rhetorical skill and creative voice. Her circle of literary patrons and protégés fostered a vibrant culture of poetic and theological exploration, and her influence helped legitimize the presence of educated women in the intellectual sphere. In more domestic settings, the daughters of merchants and gentry were frequently educated in music, embroidery, and household management, not just as practical skills, but as cultural expressions. Music, especially, was both a symbol of refinement and a form of communal engagement. Women who played instruments or sang often did so in private or semi-public gatherings, contributing to the transmission and preservation of songs, ballads, and liturgical music. While their performances were not recorded in the same way as professional musicians or male composers, their role in keeping these traditions alive cannot be understated. They taught music to their children, sang in their communities, and passed down oral histories embedded in song. In embroidery, too, Tudor daughters expressed themselves in ways that blended artistry and identity. Needlework was not merely a domestic obligation. It was a storytelling tool, a devotional practice, and a mode of political commentary. Many women designed elaborate patterns that incorporated symbols of loyalty, faith, and family lineage. Some created pieces that reflected personal reflections on morality or grief, especially during times of illness or loss. The act of stitching was both meditative and expressive, offering women a voice in fabric when they had none in public forums. These embroidered works, some of which still survive in museums and private collections, offer a vivid glimpse into how Tudor daughters participated in cultural creation. Their samplers and altar cloths, adorned with motifs of flora, fauna, and sacred texts, were more than exercises in discipline. They were statements of belief, resilience, and memory. These items often remained within families for generations, becoming both heirlooms and historical records of feminine creativity. Religious devotion was another channel through which Tudor daughters shaped cultural norms and expressions. At a time of intense religious transformation, the choices made within the home mattered immensely. Daughters, often raised to be spiritual caretakers of the household, influenced the tenor of family worship and belief. In Catholic households under Protestant rule, or Protestant ones surrounded by older traditions, women played critical roles in deciding how religion was lived day to day. Through prayer books, hymnals, and personal journals, they documented their spiritual journeys, struggles, and revelations. Some women even hosted gatherings that bordered on the subversive, quiet reading circles, prayer groups, or discussions of theology, especially in the turbulent years when the national faith was shifting. Their role in sustaining and spreading religious culture, particularly among women and children, helped define not just private devotion, but the broader cultural contours of religious life in Tudor England. Beyond their homes, some Tudor daughters engaged with the visual arts, not as producers in the conventional sense, but as patrons and curators of taste. Wealthy noblewomen often commissioned portraits, tapestries, or manuscript illuminations, carefully choosing the themes and symbols represented in them. These visual choices were rarely arbitrary. They communicated political loyalty, religious conviction, familial pride, or even personal virtue. Through the objects they commissioned, collected, or displayed, these women helped shape aesthetic values and supported the livelihoods of artists, scribes, and craftsmen. The act of commissioning a portrait, for example, was not merely about vanity. It was a declaration of presence in a world that often sought to render women invisible. A young girl depicted holding a book suggested education. A woman framed by religious symbols conveyed piety. A widow in somber black with a ring might signal loyalty and loss. Each of these visual statements contributed to a cultural dialogue about femininity, power, and memory. Even when women were not the artists, they were shaping the visual language of their time. In family libraries and estate collections, Tudor daughters were also stewards of cultural memory. They copied texts by hand, annotated margins with reflections, preserved letters and household documents, and maintained prayer books passed down through generations. In doing so, they acted as archivists and historians of the domestic sphere. Their efforts ensured that the thoughts, events, and emotions of their families were preserved. Not for public history, perhaps, but for the private narratives that shaped identity and belonging. The impact of these cultural contributions extended beyond their immediate contexts. Over time, they influenced broader shifts in how female intellect and creativity were perceived. Though still constrained by societal expectations, the cumulative effect of these women's lives began to stretch the boundaries of what was possible or permissible. Their daughters and their daughters' daughters inherited not just samplers and prayer books, but the precedent of engagement, of using one's voice, however softly, to enrich the world. Some women even found creative ways to circumvent formal restrictions on expression. They published anonymously or under pseudonyms, especially in religious or moral literature. Others wrote letters that circulated in manuscript form, carrying their thoughts far beyond their personal reach. While few of these writings were preserved in the public record, the ones that remain reveal an undercurrent of philosophical and emotional depth. They speak of longing, curiosity, conviction, and wit. They confirm what the official histories often forgot, that Tudor daughters were thinking, feeling, questioning people, engaged with the intellectual and cultural currents of their time. The domestic realm, so often dismissed as merely private or apolitical, was a rich site of cultural activity. Here, Tudor daughters sang lullabies that carried generations of folk wisdom. They decorated walls and furniture with symbolic carvings. They performed seasonal rituals and passed on oral histories. They mentored younger girls in reading and manners. They observed, remembered, interpreted, and taught. These actions may not have filled scrolls or adorned cathedrals, but they were no less central to the cultural life of their era. Tudor daughters were more than the sum of their roles as wives, mothers, or marriage prospects. They were cultural agents in their own right, educators, patrons, artists, and interpreters of their world. Their contributions, often woven into the everyday and the unseen, demand a broader lens through which to view history. For in their quiet work and creative persistence, they helped shape the character of a nation, not just its politics or dynasties, but its stories, its faith, its art, and its soul. Their legacy is not always easy to trace, but it is present still, in songs remembered, in textiles preserved, in books handed down, and in the enduring idea that value can be found even in the most overlooked places. The tales of Tudor daughters lead us naturally into a mirror held up to today, a chance to examine how far we've come, how much remains, and how women continue to redefine worth in ever-shifting contexts. Their silent resilience echoes through time, resonating in modern struggles, evolving strengths, and shifting metrics of value. Centuries later, women still grapple with expectations that echo the past. The gender pay gap remains a stubborn reality across many countries. Women often earn less than men, sometimes substantially so, even in similar roles and with comparable experience. This disparity isn't just economics. It's a signal that systems remain geared toward devaluing women's labor. Societal pressure persists to fit into prescribed roles. Most notably, the pressure to become a mother, often framed as a rite of passage or proof of fulfillment. Women who choose not to parent, or who cannot, frequently endure judgment or pity, despite vast changes in family structures and personal choice since the Tudor era. The digital age has introduced new battlegrounds for self-worth. Social media presents curated versions of life, fueling comparison and insecurity. Body image standards have proliferated online, magnifying the scrutiny placed on women's appearance. Comment sections, likes, shares, and algorithms feed insecurities, making affirmation feel conditional and external. What was once gossip whispered in court corridors now plays out globally in pixels. Yet the emotional weight remains familiar. Yet alongside these persistent struggles, the arc bends strongly toward progress. Women now occupy leadership roles across sectors from politics to business to science, roles unimaginable to Tudor daughters. Female heads of state, Fortune 500 CEOs, Nobel laureates, all are real. Economic independence has become more attainable. Women own businesses, build wealth, and make financial decisions with increasing autonomy. The rise of collective voices through social movements #MeToo, #TimesUp, marches, digital campaigns, has amplified women's experiences on a scale that makes silencing far more difficult. Solidarity has moved from whispered alliances to shared hashtags and shared platforms, forging community across distance. These changes shape how modern women define worth. No longer tethered to marriage or motherhood as endpoints, women today emphasize personal fulfillment, striving for careers that bring meaning, creative outlets that satisfy the soul, relationships chosen rather than imposed. Mental well-being is gaining recognition as fundamental to worth, not secondary to productivity. Self-care, therapy, and emotional literacy are turning inward the concern for value, toward oneself, rather than outward toward external approval. Carried forward the legacy of Tudor daughters. Modern women redefine value through multiplicity. A woman can be an artist, a scientist, a parent, a partner, an activist, all without hierarchy. Worth is measured in achievement and joy, in empathy and balance, in resilience and rest. In choosing paths that honor individuality over expectation, modern women continue the quiet revolution started long ago, transforming systems not from the top down, but from within, by living differently and demanding recognition for that difference. Through all eras, the struggle to assert one's worth remains central. But where Tudor daughters had to navigate courts, constancy of surveillance, arranged marriages, and rigid roles, women of the 21st century have leverages, legal rights, digital platforms, shared stories, to reshape the conversation entirely. And that perhaps is the greatest inheritance, the freedom not to be defined by worth assigned to us, but to define it ourselves. When we peer into history, the stories we've long accepted, of Tudor daughters as passive ornaments or footnotes to powerful men, reflect not truth, but omission. For centuries, these women were minimized or misrepresented, stripped of complexity by narratives written through male lenses or filtered by sensationalism. The enduring legacy of these misconceptions lingers, not just as historical inaccuracies, but as distortions that ripple into how we understand gender and power even today. The traditional portrayal of women like in Bullen, for example, is perhaps the most striking illustration of how skewed perspectives can seep into collective memory. Conventional histories have long depicted her as a seductress or power-hungry social climber, labels reiterated by novels, plays, and films. But modern scholarship, like Haley Nolan's re-examination, pushes back against these stereotypes, revealing an instead as a conscientious political figure, a champion of early social welfare legislation, and a victim of political machination more than personal vice. Even more extreme misconceptions have been revised in recent decades. Catherine Howard was once dismissed as a frivolous and empty-headed young woman. Newer biographies, however, reconsider her as a vulnerable adolescent, possibly manipulated and abused. These reinterpretations underscore another vital truth. Historical narratives, especially about women, often reflect biases of their authors as much as their subjects. Underlying much of this distortion is the broader pattern of historical invisibility. Women's achievements, thoughts, and decisions were often erased or relegated to footnotes. Yet they did exist, as evidenced by letters, wills, educational records, and even household inventories. Many married noblewomen, for example, played active roles in religious or political affairs, although older histories all too easily dismiss them. As one historian writes, their lives involved conspiracies, religious debates, grief, and survival, a far cry from the passive images painted by conventional accounts. This erasure is part of why feminist history has become so important. It strives to recover those voices and reframe history in a fuller, more accurate way. Our contemporary fascination with Tudor figures has also shaped, and often distorted, how we remember them. Historical fiction, television, and film have popularized simplified, sensational portrayals, turning Henry VIII into a jolly tyrant and Boleyn into a scheming temptress, Elizabeth I into a goddess queen. While these stories can draw attention to the period, they risk reinforcing myths rather than challenging them. Thankfully, contemporary scholarship and feminist historical novels have pushed back, reimagining Tudor women as multifaceted individuals, not archetypes of virtue or vice. This reclamation of women's complexity isn't just academic. It changes how we see parallels in our own lives. When we recognize how Tudor women, like Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn and others, were framed as failures or villains by patriarchal standards, it forces us to reflect. How are women still judged today? Do we still equate leadership with traditional stereotypes? Do we dismiss contributions when they don't fit the visible mold? Indeed, many of today's societal expectations echo those of the past. Women are still expected to be perfect in every role, professional, partner, parent, and judged when they prioritize differently. The same mechanisms that diminished Tudor daughters, bias, simplified storytelling, and narrow definitions of worth, still operate when women in power are labeled ambitious, emotional, or cold based on gendered norms. But the rising awareness of these patterns also delivers hope. Just as feminist historians recovered overlooked Tudor stories, modern women, and society at large, are rejecting reductive narratives. Women are redefining worth through leadership, innovation, artistry, caregiving, scholarship, and more. They claim voices once silenced and shape dialogues once dominated by others. Yet, recognizing this isn't about perfecting the past or the present, but understanding both with clarity and nuance. The enduring legacy of misconceptions about Tudor women teaches us that narratives matter, not just for our understanding of history, but for our sense of self. When we challenge distorted stories, we also make room for more authentic stories to emerge, those that embrace complexity, vulnerability, resilience, and agency. So the evolving lens through which we view Tudor daughters and 21st century women is not just a mirror, it's a bridge. It connects us to lessons about how worth is assigned and reclaimed. And it reminds us that progress begins by speaking honestly, listening fully, and honoring stories in all their depth. The threads of history are never truly inert. They shift and evolve, taking shape based on who is telling the story, who is remembered, and who is forgotten. As we trace the journeys of Tudor daughters and modern women alike, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Our collective understanding of worth has been shaped, restricted, and too often distorted by narrow lenses. But it doesn't have to remain that way. Throughout the centuries, from palaces to parlors to today's platforms, the worth of women has been measured against systems designed to limit their potential. What once revolved around dowries and heirs now manifests through pay scales, appearance metrics, social roles, and digital validation. Despite advancements, despite revolutions in rights and representation, there remains a pressing need to ask, who is defining the criteria? And more urgently, why do we still let these definitions stand unchallenged? The Tudor daughters we've revisited were not merely players in someone else's script. They thought, strategized, resisted, and suffered. Some adapted, some rebelled, some were destroyed. But all left behind imprints far deeper than the caricatures history has often presented. And Boleyn was not just an ambitious queen consort. She was a woman of conviction, intelligence, and reformist spirit. Mary I was not simply a failed monarch, but a woman forged through political trauma, familial rejection, and national instability. Elizabeth I, for all her towering legacy, lived under constant scrutiny, her womanhood both weaponized and revered depending on the political winds. In their triumphs and tragedies, these women reveal more than just moments in royal lineage. They reveal the mechanisms by which power attempts to define value, especially feminine value. And those mechanisms haven't vanished. In classrooms, on screens, in laws and institutions, outdated frameworks still shape the way worth is assigned. They still influence whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced. That is why the responsibility now lies with us. To think critically, to not accept historical narratives at face value, to recognize how deeply biased storytelling can be. The record of history has always been curated, but the stories we choose to question, expand, and elevate determine how truth moves forward. And this is not simply about correcting the past. It is about reshaping the present and building a more equitable future. When we read between the lines of what's been written, when we seek out primary voices that have been ignored, when we center interpretation not on hierarchy but on humanity, we change the culture of memory. We move from a model of historical consumption to one of historical engagement. This engagement is not reserved for academics. Everyone, students, creators, parents, professionals, plays a role in the stories we reinforce and the ones we challenge. When a film oversimplifies a powerful woman's legacy, call it out. When a classroom lesson skips over nuance, ask for more. When cultural conversations recycle myths, bring in truth. Critical thinking is not sarcasm. It is curiosity guided by care. It means approaching each account with awareness that no story is ever neutral. It means recognizing that behind every simplified character was a real person, living through constraints and choices, deserving of empathy and accuracy. And it doesn't end with the Tudors. Their lives offer a powerful case study, but the same principles apply to every era and every culture. Who gets remembered and how they're remembered reveals more about society's values than about the individuals themselves. That is why challenging history is not an act of disrespect. It is an act of justice. It gives voice to those who were misrepresented or overlooked, and it teaches us to be better stewards of memory for the future. So let this journey through the lives of Tudor daughters not be a closed chapter, but an open invitation. Question what you've learned. Explore what was left out. Seek nuance. Find voices that complicate easy stories. Let the idea of worth be one that you define on your terms, not inherited from systems of the past, but grounded in empathy, intelligence, and curiosity. Because in the end, to honor the worth of those who came before is to refuse to reduce them to symbols or footnotes. It is to see their full humanity, and in doing so, we see more of our own.